A second update of our 2025 ADP projections. That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. We haven't actually planned this. You guys know this topic, this framework that we've used. We do it every August. You guys love the show. We do it once during the season. We did it a few weeks back or a couple months ago now. Projecting the future ADP, the 2025 ADP, the next season's ADP. The reason that we're going to use this as a framework again today is it has been a really fascinating year, right? And things are changing. Running backs are continuing to score. It's the aging backs. There's a lot here. But again, as I just said, we haven't actually put together our first and second round. So the way we normally do it, we each put together our first and second rounds. We reveal them on the show. We have not done that. We instead are going to sort of alternate and pick, just sort of talk through it. We're going to use this as an opportunity to discuss something that has been a hot conversation topic. Who's going to be the first round picks next year? What's it going to be? How many running backs are going to go high? All of those big things are fun to think about. They're fun to discuss. They relate to what we think is going to happen the rest of this year. Certainly, they are a good way for us to talk about the players that we are seeing excel. I wrote up in Stealing Signals this week how dynamic Jahmyr Gibbs looked again, right? That little screen pass, I'm sure you felt the same way, Shawn. That little screen pass was Jamal Charles, which we've been talking about for,
The people I was watching with were blown away because you just don't see someone accelerate like that. Even like a Tyreek Hill. Now, Tyreek Hill is one of these guys where, the funny thing about Tyreek Hill is every time he catches the pass, when he's not just running unmolested, he catches it, he immediately runs 4 yards in the wrong direction in order to get away from the defenders because then he wants to beat you. He does have this ability when he catches one sort of on the edge to beat guys around the corner that just no other NFL player could possibly ever do. Tyreek Hill is one of a kind. The acceleration from Jahmyr Gibbs on that play, and they were talking about it at the time that he had one of the fastest times. Ben, I believe that his previous sort of long run that was recorded as a really fast time by the GPS or however they're tracking him was number 3. That play, I believe, is now number 5. So I think that he's got the 3rd and 5th fastest times in the NFL this year with the ball in his hands, which again, if you've seen that play or just watched Jahmyr Gibbs play at all, not surprising.
No, it's surprising because I thought you were going to tell me it broke the record for the fastest. I genuinely don't know how he hit the gears that he hit. He got to 4th gear and then 5th gear and then somehow got to 6th gear. He was moving. He was like, oh, I have space. And also I'm going to eat up this space angrily, so fast and so aggressively that it made every other player on an NFL football field look like they were walking in cement. It was weird how explosive he looked compared to everyone. The Jaguars aren't really trying. The Lions had a game there where they scored. Their first team offense, Shawn, played 7 possessions, and they scored a touchdown on all 7 possessions. Never seen anything like it. I don't know how to look that up. People look up stuff like that all the time. I'm sure that's some kind of a record. It had to have been. It was. And then I wrote about it in Signals. They had 3 third downs. It was just hot knife through butter all game. The Lions looked so dynamic. But I brought up Gibbs because he's one of these players that from a talent perspective, but I got questions about him versus in the Signals Gold versus some players that have better workloads, right? And we always talk about the workload versus the efficiency, the EP versus the fantasy points over expected. The EP stuff really, really matters. And Jahmyr Gibbs does, not necessarily get all the way there. Although, even though he's sort of at a 50-50 split with David Montgomery, even maybe a little bit better than 50-50 on his side, this is a Lions team that generates, so much scoring and so much EP that it's almost like those guys can be in line from an EP perspective with some of the backs that get 75% of their backfield on some of the bad ones. The pie is huge.
Well, and one of the things is they're basically those two guys are right even with Derrick Henry. Now, when you look at the market share of the running back EP, then Henry would appear to be in a better position going forward. But all 3 of those guys are living on monster efficiency, and you would expect it to continue.
Right.
Because, I mean, the thing with the Lions is just so sad is that if you separated out all of their guys, I mean, Sam Laporta would be probably the third best tight end after Brock Bowers and Trey McBride. I mean, Jamison Williams would be just such a electric, exciting superstar on so many teams. He's a role player in Detroit. Amon-Ra St. Brown would be having Cooper Kupp peak types of seasons on most teams. I mean, Jahmyr Gibbs would be the running back one with a margin if he played for about 25 NFL teams.
Yeah.
So
But the case I was going to make, though, is it's still not as bad. I mean, despite that, because that's true, it's still not as bad as it looks, because even though they're splitting it, like you said, their value, their EP is almost on the Henry level. And then because the offensive line is so good and they score so many points, I mean, these guys both score a touchdown every game, both running back. I mean, is there a running back in the league that you're more confident is going to score than both Detroit running backs? I mean, Henry's one of them, but there are not that many. They're both going to score every single game.
well, I was watching, as you and I both are doing now, where we watch the games kind of in chunks. And the Detroit game was really sort of depressing in part because we had started Jamison Williams. And I mean, I don't know that anyone has ever, at least, I mean, obviously people do all the time, but has so completely nailed a narrative that came through in a way that just changed everything, quite like you did with this one. But you're like, we need to start Jamison Williams because the Lions are not going to let Jared Goff sit on the 5 interceptions. They're going to come back and go absolutely crazy. So then I watched the first half, and we have these first 3 possessions are 3 running back touchdowns, and you feel like you're watching a super lame team like the Texans or the Packers or the Washington Commanders. And you're like, yeah, I mean, you can't stop the Lions, but it's all David Montgomery and then a little bit of Jahmyr Gibbs. So I was a little bit down about that, was discussing with somebody I'm 6-7 hours into watching the games, but you can only make so much progress. And I was just like, we just needed Jared Goff to do something a little bit earlier. And the response was, Jared Goff threw for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. Maybe you're okay.
Because they came out in the second half and they just didn't stop. I mean, this is a team that is going to generate so much fantasy. I mean, you're right. There's only one ball, and they're not going to do what they did this week every week, but they're so good. You look at the individual profiles individually, and this is going to go into our analysis as we break down the 2025 ADP and what we think and whether we think these players are good. People get really caught up with the stuff like the market share of EP that you're talking about with Henry versus the Lions. There's a big element here where it doesn't matter. I mean, David Montgomery is good and Jahmyr Gibbs is otherworldly, but it almost doesn't matter if they're good, right? Like, I think you could put a really bad running back behind there because they're so dynamic offensively and their offensive line is that good that bad running back would still score some points. He wouldn't be great, but he would show positive in the fantasy points over expected because the situation is that amazing. We should expect dynamic efficiency in the above the EP number, in addition to the fact that the pie is huge and it will split favorably for each of the individual profiles. I mean, Shawn, I think Gibbs I think he's in the discussion for the top 5 picks next year. I think he has to be one of the very most exciting players, because then the other side of it is what happens if something happens to David Montgomery and those types of things. I had somebody ask me over on the Signals Gold Q&A this week about trading for Montgomery when they had Gibbs, and I was like, go ahead, you can start them both. They're both great individual profiles. And then their point was they had another decent back, I can't remember who, but if they were like, well, if one of them goes down, the other one's going to be a league winner. I'm like, yeah, you're right. You're just going to consolidate into a monster role for either of the Lions backs and then plug somebody else in alongside them. It seems like a good problem to have both the Lions running backs on a fantasy team.
And then to give a little bit of context for what Derrick Henry is doing, all 3 of these guys have about the same EP in that, 12.5 to 13.5 range, with Henry as first. But Montgomery is at 3.1 fantasy points over expected per game. Really good number. Jahmyr Gibbs is at 4.8. Pretty crazy number. Derrick Henry is at 7.1. He's averaging more than a touchdown worth of just pure efficiency every game.
In part, I mean, I know I've talked about this with the EP and the FPOE stuff. In part, that's because his EP is somewhat hampered by the fact that he doesn't catch passes. And so, I mean, every rush attempt is a lot lower on the EP scale, and then the touchdowns are always, but he's so efficient on them as well. But the touchdowns are always going to generate FPOE is what I was going to say. Like, even if it's from the 1, the EP is 3 points, but then he gets 6. And so he gets +3 on that play. And he just keeps scoring every single time he gets the ball in close, which.
Well, the big plays just, change everything. Right. At some point, I've written about this at several junctures of the season where Barkley has some weird peripherals. For anybody else, they'd be bad. But again, the whole point is that long speed is hugely important. And so, he was stuffed more than any other back in football last week, or I should say he was hit at the line. Etienne and Kamara were actually stuffed the most, I believe. You can get hit, you can get stopped over and over. If you're going to then break off a couple of long touchdowns, you're going to be fine. Players like Barkley, Henry is a weird one. I talk all the time about how he runs like a small back, and it's a huge compliment. And then, you have Jahmyr Gibbs. The Gibbs thing is tough because, and one of the things I pointed out too, that's sort of interesting, Gibbs has this crazy number in yards before contact. Barkley and Henry have crazy numbers in yards after contact, but Gibbs actually has the best evasion rate, right? He is evading the most tackles per play. And so when you look at that, you shouldn't get too caught up in where a defender got a hand on or made contact with the back. When you're up in that 6 yards per carry range because of your explosiveness. Now, again, can you manage that? Can you sustain that for extremely long periods of time? No, probably not if you're not Jamal Charles. But it's not fluky that someone is doing it before contact if they are Jahmyr Gibbs. And you can look at some of these runs for Barkley or Henry. If they had been categorized just slightly differently, it's going to change that dynamic. It's not going to change how good the back is.
I think that's all really well said. We could break down. We should start the draft is what I was going to say. The name we haven't even mentioned yet, I wrote as the 101 right now and for the rest of the season in signals this week, which is Christian McCaffrey, who is right back to a 95% snap share role, 12 targets, 10 catches in his 2 games, hasn't scored a touchdown yet, but the receiving role is exactly where it was or where you would expect it to be. The offense has been hollowed out. They've already had their bye. They do have a tough schedule the rest of the way, but if he's going to play 90% of the snaps, he's got a scoring range that is unique. Is he the 101 next year? Probably not after the Achilles stuff. Why don't you kick us off? Who's going to be the 101 at this point right now next year?
Well, I gave you the 101 there and put it in for McCaffrey. Do you not want that? It's going to be Ja'Marr Chase.
We have a document somewhere? No, sorry. McCaffrey's the 101 right now. If we're drafting for the rest of the season, I think you want Christian McCaffrey more than you want any other player. I don't believe he's going to be the 101 for 2025, which is the exercise we're doing. You just said you put in the name. You got to share that document with me so I can follow along as well. Ja'Marr Chase is your pick for the 101 next year over all the running backs.
Yeah, he's destroying everybody in fantasy scoring. He's doing it despite the slow start. He's back to being what he was as a rookie, where it looked like he was going to be the 101 maybe for like 10 straight years. So to derail this for a moment, the Bengals-Chargers game was old school football at its finest during a week when there were a lot of boring games. Colin and I
you don't mean that as you don't mean old school football as like ground and pound. You mean old school football as in they used to throw the ball at each other.
Then LA scored on touchdown drives of 4, 5, and 8 plays. Justin Herbert had an ADOT above 12 and threw 19 incomplete passes. They had 5 second half possessions with 4 or fewer plays. It was absolutely glorious. Glorious. Right? At one point in this game, you're thinking that the Chargers have arrived and that they are the team that is going to challenge the Chiefs or the Bills or whoever you want to put at the very top of the AFC. And then like half an hour later, you're like, oh, the Bengals are going to win easily, and might have if they hadn't just kept missing field goals. So
they failed the down 14 go for 2 challenge, and if they actually do that correctly, which this is one of the indisputable ones, where if you go for 2 the first time, you give yourself a free look at whether or not you're getting that. I mean, it's certainly possible that you could miss both 2-point conversions, but the math basically comes out to, can you make 1 out of 2 conversions more often than you can miss both? And if that's the case, then you should do it. And it's roughly a 50-50 proposition for most offenses. So you should do it, because you're not going to probably miss both more than you're going to make 1. And if you can make 1 enough times, then you should try that. And if you make it on the first one, then you just kick the extra point on the second one. And then, so if they would have actually done that and happened to have made it on the first one in their big come from behind, and they absolutely should have, then all those it changes that late game. So the whole game would have been very different down the stretch. They would have been trying to kill more clock, probably not settling for field goals. They settled for 2 long field goals to break a tie at 27-27 that could have been 28-27 had they done that one little hack that everyone pretty much agrees you should do at this point in football. Now, they would have also had to go their favor, because it may not have. If they missed that first conversion, they would have then needed to get the second conversion, and it wouldn't.
They had multiple chances at field goals afterward, though, which would have also been able to balance some of those things out.
But if they were lead, they might have. If they had missed it, correct, they could have balanced it out. If they were leading by 1, though, they might not have tried for a field goal, right? Instead of being tied to take the lead, the field goal feels it's different when the field goal is pushing a 1-point lead to a 4-point lead. Maybe they're going for it on 4th down, or I just think everything's a lot different after that point. But low key, Zach Taylor hurt his team there by not optimizing when they were coming back, and then you see how it affects the late game. They also would have probably ran more clock. Both teams had the ball 3 times after it went to 27-27, like you were saying. And the Chargers finally win at the end, but the Chargers may not get that possession, right? If the Bengals are up by 1, there's a lot of ways this could have played differently, but I thought that was.
So there are a variety of things to touch on here. One is that I had people reach out to me and say, you definitely should not do devil's advocate when Ben completely perfectly explains the go for 2 thing on the previous week. It was obviously a brutal mistake from Sean McVay. The other point
no, you heard that from somebody? I apologize.
Well, no, I mean, it was definitely the case, and I want to state that so people aren't confused about it. The way you explained it completely and totally and 100% the way that you have to go. Then, as I was watching this game, and then as I was trying to process how angry I was about the Green Bay Packers, and then even what we continue to see with the Chiefs. And then, I mean, I love Laramie Tunsil, but you practice the first play of the game for a reason, and it's not to execute it the most incorrectly you possibly can. We talked about this before, which is that let's change the rules so you can line up. I still want the same number of eligible receivers, right? You can have a way to still designate that. I mean, I don't think the defense should have to cover everybody, but you can line up however you want. You can have multiple guys in motion before the snap, all of those types of things. That will make football better. I don't expect
an eligible downfield should no longer be a penalty.
Right. Exactly. I also want, in the interest of games like Chargers-Bengals, which one of the things that you immediately think about is the Chiefs game in the playoffs several years ago, where they got way behind the Texans and caught up by halftime. You know how many plays it would take the Chiefs to catch up 3 scores down these days? 153, right? Possessions should be limited to 10 plays. You shouldn't be able to punt. When you get to the end of your drive, field goals of 53 plus should be 4 points. And if you're going to kick a field goal, you should always have the option of placing the ball at the 45 and kicking it for a 4-pointer. Even if you have moved it down closer, you can voluntarily move back. Going for 2 should become a situation where it's worth 3 points. You get 2 plays to score from the 10, and it's also make it, take it.
You just threw. I've never heard you say any of these. You can voluntarily kick a 55-yarder for 4 points, and you can do make it, take it, but you get 2 plays to go for the conversion. It's also make it, take it. I mean, I'm in.
Which we have to have, because the onside kicks, most of the kicking stuff is terrible, right? You can fix all of those things. Anyway, I don't have those perfectly calibrated. Some of those may be off, but the general ideas for how you could fix what's now wrong with football, which is that huge chunks of games are unwatchable. And then you have Chargers Bengals, like, we need to nudge things in that direction a little bit. So I'm not saying that the Bengals are going to run 78 plays every game, just like the Green Bay Packers are going to occasionally run more than 43. But Ja'Marr Chase, I mean, he's the 101.
Ja'Marr Chase is the 101. I love that. I love that breakdown. I just made the case recently that, like, there's not that much that's wrong with the NFL right now. It's in the healthiest place that it's been in years. You're like, we need to change the entire sport to fix everything that's wrong with it. It has been a bad couple of weeks. There's been more bad football in the last couple of weeks than there were earlier in the year. Like, we were talking about the number of games that are unwatchable, and you just said there's a lot of there've been more the last couple. And certainly the last couple seasons, right? It's been a trend with the way the defense is playing now. The sport has changed. Defenses are not going to just let you throw downfield anymore, and that changes everything to a certain degree. I love the Chase call. Pretty fascinated by it. Now I have to pick the 102. And I mean, if Chase is the 101, then I think Jefferson is always not far behind. It feels like running backs are going to go this high, but I don't even know who the 101 of running backs is, who the RB1 is. There's like 5 you could make the case for. Jefferson, I think, is the clear next wide receiver. So I'm going to punt it back over to you and take Justin Jefferson. If those guys go like 105, 106, and the running backs are going like top 4 picks, like a lot of people think, I mean, those guys will be easy picks there. They do belong at the very top. They're very, very good.
Well, and you've really got us set in the right direction for, what the difficult conversation and decision for everybody's going to be next year. Because, I mean, already right now, Derrick Henry's volume is a huge problem. He's going to be another year older. The idea of a linear decline in terms of the explosiveness, the health, the production from the backs, or for any of the players is not accurate, right? So we don't know when these guys are going to be different. What's the appetite going to be for players like Henry and like Saquon Barkley, who have either workload problems or high value touch problems and are a little bit older? And what's the appetite going to be for Joe Mixon, who has, again, very disconcerting peripherals and has never really been good? And at some point, the Texans might realize that they can throw the ball again.
You would hope they would, but they don't know that yet. And Joe Mixon is the leading, RB1, the leader in points per game. He's only played 8 games, but that's a 22.6 points per game in PPR. He looks pretty good. A lot of touchdowns, right? I mean, touchdowns matter.
They do. I think that drafters are going to feel like they can get their running back points because they're such good depth. Then I was writing today for the Zero RB universe that if Isaiah Pacheco is available this week, which I don't know exactly where the Chiefs are with that, but if he is, the first 33 running backs drafted this year will be available in week 12. Now, some of them are on buys, but the idea that you could be at this point in a season. Now, there have been guys who have missed big chunks.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's madness. It's absolute 33, the top 33 running backs. And I had a really interesting conversation with a reader / listener over on Blue Sky this morning. It was a really good one, back and forth about like best ball and the running backs and some of those things. And he was kind of talking about how some of the running backs in hindsight look really great. And I was talking about how that's, one of the really hardest things is when they hit and everything goes right, the running backs always look that way in hindsight, right? I mean, that's not the whole extent of that long conversation or the way that, like, Sean, you and I are going to break down running backs this offseason. I've written about it a lot over at the newsletter. There's a lot to think about with the running back position going forward, I think. And I wrote this week that I'm excited to be a little bit more sort of, I think I used the word delicate or something with the way that I parse this stuff, because I do think it's an interesting conversation, a really interesting conversation. But it is undeniably true that when the running backs hit the way that they have, they look awesome in hindsight. They look like they were always going to be this good. It's, there's a question of workload. There's a question of offenses being good enough. There's a question of health, right? And these guys are all healthy. They're in lineups, like you said, and they're producing. They're scoring a lot of the touchdowns. It's a fascinating position to think about and look at going forward. So you're saying at 103, you're going to go wide receiver again?
I think it's got to be CeeDee Lamb. He's too good. You're going to have, at some point in the draft, a massive collapse in wide receiver value. And I think it's going to be early. So when you talk about this top tier, CeeDee Lamb was the 102. Obviously, the Cowboys have had all of these issues. We don't know what they're going to be from a coaching staff perspective next year. But we do know that CeeDee Lamb is an absolute star, and they would have a lot of work to do to fix all of the depth around him for his workload, target volume, what have you, within the offense not to be extremely high to where he then still gaps basically everybody else is going to be available.
CeeDee Lamb, I'm going to go Bijan Robinson. I'm going to make him the 101 at running back. I think the Atlanta situation is favorable enough. We've seen enough from like Cousins and the weapons downfield from the offensive coordinator. Obviously, early season, they were a little bit slow with the Achilles stuff. Bijan had a stretch there of like 5 straight 20-point games. He's not had a lot of the long, explosive plays. I do think they're there. I think we're going to get some down the stretch. I think he's going to finish this year really well. We just said last week we thought he was going to finish as the RB1. He has one of his worst games in some time in between there, but I still think he's going to rebound, have a really strong rest of the season. The receiving profile is really good. The biggest concern really is sort of the touchdown equity with him, and that's part of why he hasn't scored great. He has 7 total touchdowns. A lot of these other backs are in the double digits already, and some of them well into the double digits. We're talking about double the 7, right? Up around 14. Derrick Henry has 15, right? Mixon has 11 in 8 games. Barkley has 10. James Cook has 11. David Montgomery already has 10. I mean, there's Kyron Williams has 10. There's a bunch of backs at double digits. Bijan only has 7. Just a couple weeks ago, Tyler Algier got goal line carries on 3 straight plays, got stuffed on all 3, and then Bijan scored on 4th. I think he's going to get – Algier got 1 touch last week. The Falcons are another team that didn't run a lot of plays. They end up getting kind of run out of Denver a little bit. Michael Penix played double-digit snaps. Can't remember the exact number. Had it in the write-up this week, but they only ran like 55 plays, but Penix played like 12 or 13 or 14 of those or something. It was more like low 40s for the starting offense in Atlanta as well this week. So that's part of why Bijan had a rough week. I think Bijan's going to close strong. Young player, right? The drafters are going to care about age. They're going to care about profile. Former top 10 pick. This is the RB1 for next year, I think, profile-wise. It could be Brees as well. I mean, that's another name that is very similar. They've been weaving in and out of each other all year. It's crazy how similar their narratives have been.
Are you concerned at all that a little bit of what we've gotten with the Falcons and their effectiveness from a whole offense perspective, not specifically Bijan's, which I would think, I mean, Bijan is awesome. I'm certainly not suggesting his performance is necessarily because of schedule, but this was another game that really gave us a sense of just where the NFC South is. And they've actually played almost all of their NFC South games. Now, the flip side of that is that if you only have one more game in the NFC South, their schedule is about as easy as it can possibly be. So A schedule perspective probably doesn't cause problems, but is this team, I wouldn't say as bad as they looked in week 11, but it does seem like, I mean, even if you're like me and you think the Denver Broncos have a good defense and you think Bo Nix is suddenly one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL, this is a bad loss that is probably not really indicative of where they are, but it does raise some red flags. I mean, they looked unbelievably overmatched.
I actually didn't write it up that way. I wrote actually the inverse, that they looked more overmatched than they were, basically. That, football's a game of possessions. From my perspective on this one, the Broncos got away with, Nick's got away with a couple kind of risky throws in the flat in this game. Although, he has an incredible game. He only has 5 incompletions in the whole game, but he threw a couple balls, like just lasers that were tightly covered in the flat that maybe could have been picked off or something. I want to get the possession chart up somewhere, but they finished drives. They had some key third downs. They had Mike Pereira on the broadcast called the catch fumble overturn that went in their favor shocking, that it should have stood and it got overturned. But that was another one that led to a touchdown. They were able to get touchdowns on several drives, the Broncos.
He did come back and explain why.
Yeah. It
was pretty borderline.
Yeah, it was a pretty borderline overturn. But yeah, he did kind of walk it back and say that, okay, it makes some sense. But the Falcons didn't finish their drives. They didn't end up putting up a ton of yards, but they did have a couple like decent drives. And then one of the other things is the Broncos got the ball first and had the last real drive of the half. So in the first half, they both had 1 punt, but the Broncos had 3 touchdowns and the Falcons had 2 field goals. And it was 21-6 at half. And you're like, okay, well, both teams moved the ball into scoring range on all but one drive in the first half. One team scored TDs, the other team kicked field goals, and they were longer field goals for the Falcons, but they were able to move the ball a little bit. Then they went 3 and out to start the second half. Atlanta Broncos go down there and scores a TD. I thought Atlanta's defense just couldn't get stops, is sort of was the big storyline, but I didn't think their offense was terrible. They still play in the NFC South next year, right? They're still going to be against those same teams. So it's going to be, we knew coming in Atlanta's schedule was meaningfully the easiest on paper based on, looking ahead at what was expected of these teams. We talked about that a little bit in the offseason. It's part of the reason I was in on these guys a ton, is like all throughout the year, they're just projected to play bad teams, basically. So it's not surprising that even as we've updated that in season, their schedule still looks pretty easy the rest of the way. It'll be tough for next year for sure, but I still think Bijan's going to close this year well enough, and drafters aren't going to be super worried about, the schedule getting harder. They're going to be in on this young star. He's going to be a top 5 pick.
I'm going to go ahead and go with Saquon at the 105. Okay. It's not what I would do, but I also don't think it's a terrible pick by any stretch. And I do think it's what drafters will do. And the reason that I think it's easily justifiable is that unless you get some kind of an injury that would sap the explosiveness down the stretch, the dynamism that he's developed is going to be the lasting impression that people get from the season. And you have this interesting kind of offset with the Eagles offense where the high value touches, what he's doing without getting the goal line carries, because we keep getting these sneaks, and what he's doing without receptions, it's absolutely absurd. But I do think the offense is responsible for part of that, which is, again, one of the things that people said coming into the year in his favor. And then you get, these big plays with what they set up. One of the things that I thought was really clear against the Commanders was that, Jalen Hurts is just not playing well. And it gets covered up for fantasy because he's scoring all of these rushing touchdowns. But he has plays out there every week to A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith that I wouldn't say most, but a lot of quarterbacks can make. He is not making them. 2 of the last 3 games, Saquon Barkley's opportunities are off the charts. And part of that is to cover up Jalen Hurts. So, we get that dynamic as we go down the stretch. 28 pass attempts in this game.
28 pass attempts in this game. He had gone 5 straight prior to that with 25 or fewer. They are kind of just hiding the pass game right now. It's been, I mentioned to you a few weeks back, and you said you'd have to just agree to disagree that I thought A.J. Brown's playing in the very top tier of wide receivers, but he's being held back by volume. And I mean, that's really what I meant. The first 4 games of the year, they threw 30 plus times. Then they went 5 straight throwing 25 or fewer, which is really low volume, like incredibly low. 28 in this game. It's I mean, their pass rate over expected, however you want to look into it, it's very run heavy. They're leaning into Saquon to be their offense. I think they agree with sort of what you're saying.
And so I do think that the long runs are a bit of a fluke. But at the same time, imagine what would happen if you got it. It doesn't seem super likely that we're going to get this, but imagine what would happen if they actually tweaked the offense a tad bit to get him some more high value touches. And then you're talking about someone who the overall mix is just, absolutely crazy. I think you have a variety of ways to win with Saquon, and he's clearly at his peak right now. It doesn't mean that he will be next year, but I think that you have to evaluate the running backs even more than other positions on where the guy is today. He's playing awfully, awfully well. I don't think that we have any extreme, age health concerns. When you're talking about redraft for next year, he should be high and will be.
Yeah, I think he will be. It's really tough here because part of the reason we wanted to do this exercise, I think whoever winds up at like 110 or 111, people are going to be like, how do you have him that low? And it would have been the case if we would have pushed Saquon down that far. There are multiple other backs that I think need to come off with Bijan and Saquon. I don't want to have Bijan ranked multiple spots ahead of some of these backs. I just said that him and Brees are sort of indistinguishable, but Brees is scoring a little bit worse, right? Like 1.3 points per game. The Aaron Rodgers stuff to me is a little bit more concerning. And I think, if he's back next year, it's not great again for Brees. I don't know that I would want to be taking him this high. And I think people will be concerned about the Jets overall. I don't know that I can go Brees here. There's also receivers. We started with Chase Jefferson and Lamb. We're just talking about like Amon-Ra, for example. He's had such a great year. You have to have him in the discussion in these top tiers. There's players at other positions, Sean. We like to do the tight end premium thing. Are we doing that here? Because if we're, I think we're not. Because I think if we were, we would have already said
we are. Have we missed the person who should have been the 101?
I think he should have been the 101. I'm going to take Brock Bowers right now at 106. I don't think there's any way he's a late first round pick next year in tight end premium leagues. I don't think he falls out of the top 5. We probably missed the guy that should have been the 103 or so.
Well, he's going to easily score more points than Justin Jefferson or CeeDee Lamb. I think that Justin Jefferson, for me, is the person
that doesn't
where
belong.
I wonder if it is actually off the board at this point. They have the other 2 guys, right? And Jordan Addison, who finally was involved, which was great to see, and TJ Hawkinson. And then it's going to be JJ McCarthy. Sam Darnold can barely play, but we have no idea what JJ McCarthy is. And that could be
the social media
as well.
The social media response to Justin Jefferson's season this year is he's the best receiver in the league by far from a talent perspective, which is weird because Chase is doing incredible, but we never should have questioned whether the quarterback mattered to Justin Jefferson's ability to score.
He's going to underscore his ADP from this year.
I'm saying that the cultural opinion on Justin Jefferson is going to be that it was a massive mistake to have ever put him outside the top 5 at any point in his career, basically. Because he was going at 106, 108 this year. And you're right. He's right now in points per game. He is the wide receiver 8. He is not blowing anyone away. He's not right behind Chase. Now that includes some players that have missed time. Rashee Rice is the wide receiver 2 by the list I'm looking at. And then there's 3 other guys in the top 7 that have only played 6 games. Cooper Kupp, Nico Collins, T. Higgins is all the way up there. Chris Godwin is also in the top 7 with 7 games. So a lot of these guys are hurt. But in terms of, he's at 18.1 points per game. Ja'Marr Chase is at 22.9. He is 4.8 points per game higher. Some of that has happened just in the last couple of weeks, and some of what I'm referencing is more like 3 to 4 weeks old, to be completely fair. But there was a lot of certainty and a lot of confidence that it was wrong, very, very wrong, to have ever questioned Justin Jefferson's ability to score at the elite level. And I will say, he's not scoring poorly. I mean, if this
No,
is
he's doing
if
just
this is
fine.
his
You're not
floor,
upset,
yeah,
but I mean, he's had to do unreal things, make highlight catches every week. A ton of the interceptions that Sam Darnold has thrown are trying to force him the ball. I mean, potentially one of the things that happens with a decent quarterback is that you get a better balance between Jefferson, Addison, and Hawkinson, which we have only seen Hawkinson play a couple games. We don't really know how that's going to develop. My concerns about Jefferson are not that he's not one of the greatest players of all time, but I don't necessarily think that he's gapped from CeeDee Lamb and Ja'Marr Chase to the extent that
CeeDee Lamb scoring behind him, has 20 more targets and 140 fewer yards.
the Dallas Cowboys have been really, really bad. The thing that we expect for the Cowboys is that they'll have a better quarterback than Justin Jefferson will have next year. That's not the entire story. But at the 107 here, I'm going to take a player who I also think will have a better quarterback next year than Justin Jefferson and is set up to have more volume, and that's Malik Neighbors.
Neighbors. I did wonder how far he might fall. He's in a good position. I agree, because they will bring in a quarterback next year, and he sort of already showed us all we need to know. His rookie season is kind of the way you put it a few weeks ago after the concussion cost him 2 games, that lost its momentum. And I think that's a really good way of putting it. He was like early in the season, it was like, they're going to throw to him 15 times every game. He misses 2 games, and suddenly it's like, why are we not throwing to Malik Neighbors every single time anymore? It's a little bit different. Going into next year, better quarterback play. Definitely think he'll be a target. I'll be interested to see if he goes 107 ahead of some of the running backs we haven't named, some of the wide receivers we have not named. I think I would have pushed him down a little bit further.
Well, Ben, give me a mulligan there. Christian McCaffrey's not going to fall out of the top 7. So let's go ahead and put McCaffrey in that spot.
That's the other name that I think we needed to get off the board fairly quickly. And then I'm going to take Jahmyr Gibbs, actually, at 108. I don't think he can fall any further the way that I think he's going to finish. I don't think he was a 1-2 turn guy this year, but he's having another dynamic season, and the Lions look so dynamic. And I think he goes higher next year than he did this year for good reason.
So you're not concerned about their ability to support all of the guys? It becomes one of the things I do think that we did right this year and helped listeners with was just understanding that, for me, Amon-Ra, who, he's had some good games. He had the massive game just this most recent week, but I don't think that in the current setup, the ceiling is there for him. And certainly when you could contrast Laporta with the options you were going to have much later, I don't think that he was even necessarily that bad of a pick, but as you look to figure out how you address different positions, you couldn't take him. Gibbs will be interesting. I actually want 2 picks here at 109. I'm going to go ahead and push Neighbors again. I think the Neighbors,
because now you know that I'm not going to take him.
Well,
and I did just make the case that he'll be a little bit further back. Who's your 109?
I think that Achane is
okay
in the mix to be the first back off the board.
Off the board. So, he'll have to do more the rest of the year to get there. You think he's going to do more the rest of the for me, the concern is Tua, the concussions, and the fact that when Tua was out, Achane's role and production and everything was a lot worse. And I think people do get spooked by that. They cling to those types of things where they're like, what if Tua has another concussion? We'll be screwed, But I think you're right in terms of what he is and who he can be. But so my point is, I don't think there's a gap between Gibbs and Achane. I think this is right. They belong next to each other. You're kind of saying maybe I went a little early with Gibbs. I think what Gibbs is going to do the rest of the way is going to solidify him in the top 8. We just talked about how good he was last week. He's going to make some huge plays down the stretch. He's going to have a 40-point game a fantasy game in the NFL playoffs this year. And then people are going to be like, I want to take him 3rd overall. I mean, it's just like they've used him more than Montgomery deliberately in key spots. They use Montgomery early in games, but more often than not, it's been 60 to 40 or 65-35 snaps. Like, they know Gibbs is their player. And when we get to the the NFL playoffs, they're going to use Montgomery, but Gibbs is going to play 70% snaps a couple of times in the NFL playoffs. And people are going to lose their minds because he's going to score a ton of points. I think he's the best running back in the NFL probably right now. He's so dynamic.
No, I think that he is the best running back in the NFL. I don't even think that there is that much of an argument about it. The problem is simply that David Montgomery, in the way that SIS categorizes things, which is based on EPA with their positive percentage, their boom percentage, their bust percentage, is different buckets of EPA. He's got the highest positive percentage in the NFL. Now, he doesn't have a ton of routes, but he also has the highest yards per route at running back of anybody with 20 plus targets. So you're not going to vanquish him. Yeah, whereas Achane has put the other Dolphins backs in the rear view. And so 2 of our very favorite guys here are having really interesting seasons. Nobody gets stuffed in the NFL more than Rachaad White. That's not surprising. What is surprising is the next 2 backs are Achane and Breece Hall. So Breece Hall is running behind an offensive line that has the worst blown block percentage in the league. He's not unbelievable at making that first guy miss or running over him. I mean, that's really the only thing that Breece Hall isn't extraordinary at. And so it's not a great fit when your guys are also just blowing their blocks left and right. The Dolphins are also among the 5 worst. It's not a surprise that, these guys are struggling when their offensive lines are playing so poorly. Achane had 73 yards in week 11. 71 of them were after contact. But these 2 guys are also, in some ways, the next Christian McCaffrey, or have that in them, in that Hall is number 1 in routes. He's number 2 in receiving yards. A little bit of that, he's played an extra game over some of the guys. He's obviously been going to bye this week. Hall and Achane have 46 receptions. Each player averages 8 receiving expected points per game. And so you would love for them even to tick up to 9 to 10 to get that kind of double EP, because both of them also have this sort of embedded potential to jump into that 4 fantasy points over expected per game that a lot of the backs are currently in, but they are not. I have more confidence that the Dolphins will rectify some of their problems in the offseason, and that even though Achane is probably never going to get some extreme workload, what we're already seeing with guys like, a Derrick Henry, for example, and what we saw with Achane his first season, is that if you have the ability to create those splash plays, you can overcome some of that. I think that Achane's workload is going to be low-key really strong in 2025. And I think if he's still on the board at this spot, he's going to be an absolute slam dunk pick.
I love it. I'm going to take Breece Hall. I think we're at 110. We got to take him already. And he's one of these guys that people are going to be like, how did Breece Hall fall to 110? You already talked about Derrick Henry. Joe Mixon is the current RB1. There's other names that have not gone off yet, and we may not even pick until well into the second. I don't know. But Kenneth Walker was one of our RB1s. He's the RB5 right now in points per game. These guys are not off the board yet. Like I said, there's going to be some guys when we get to like 205 that our listeners are going to tell us we're crazy for having them fall there. That's why this exercise is fun. It's hard to pick the 101 and the 102, and then you get to like 109, and you're like, these guys have to come off. Like they like somebody, at some point. I think Breece has done enough. He had a great game this week. I think he's gonna score well down the stretch. He's gonna continue to make big plays. He's done enough. He's young. He's talented. I think there's going to be enough optimism around Breece Hall that he's still going to be a late first-round pick.
Well, he's basically Saquon Barkley, but with the receiving element. And so a lot of what happens, or what will determine where those 2 guys are selected next year, is simply going to be how many long touchdowns do they score relative to each other down the stretch. I think that's going to be the thing that determines it. Well, really cool part about this exercise, I think it does hammer home just how fun the first round will be in 2025, in part because we've gotten such great health this year. And that also does make a big difference. I'm going to go ahead and take Neighbors at this spot, even though, I mean, there's another guy out there that, again, people are going to be like, he should be in the top 5, who is still available.
And I'm going to take him probably, Amon-Ra St. Brown at 112, unless that's not who you were thinking of. But I don't think Amon-Ra St. Brown can fall out of the first round. So at 112, if there's a different other one that you're saying should be off the board, then you're going to have to take him at 201.
Well, I'm going to take Tyreek Hill at 201.
Oh, there's another guy that I hadn't even really thought about, but he's really good at football too. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get all the players off. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown had not gone yet. I don't think he's going to fall to 112.